On a foggy morning in November 2023, a rusting Aframax tanker sits anchored off the coast of Laconia, Greece. Its name, freshly painted in white letters, reads Turba. 3 months ago, this same vessel was called NS Creation. 6 months before that, it was the Virgo Sun. If you pulled up its registration documents, you'd find a corporate maze, a shell company in the Marshall Islands, an address that leads to a mailbox in Dubai, and an insurance policy issued by a firm no Western underwriter has ever heard of. This ship is carrying 700,000 barrels of Russian crude. It left the port of Primorsk in the Baltic Sea, transmitted its location for exactly 11 hours, then went dark. For 5 days, its AIS transponder, the maritime equivalent of a plane's black box, was silent. When it reappeared, it was 400 miles south, sailing under a new flag. The oil on board was purchased at $61 per barrel, just below the $60 price cap imposed by the G7. On paper, everything is legal. In practice, no one knows who really owns this ship, who insured it, or where the money went. This is not an anomaly. This is the system. There are now over 600 ships like Turba moving Russian oil across the globe. They are the shadow fleet, a floating gray market worth $180 billion a year, operating in the gap between sanctions and reality. And they represent the biggest unspoken truth about economic warfare in the 21st century. You can't turn off a faucet when the pipes have learned to flow in the dark. What the West designed as a chokehold became a masterclass in adaptive evasion. In December 2022, the G7 nations, led by the United States and the European Union, unveiled what they called the most sophisticated sanctions architecture in history. The goal was elegantly simple: cap the price of Russian oil at $60 per barrel. Russia could still sell its oil because the world needed supply, but it would have to sell cheap. The mechanism: deny Russia access to Western shipping, insurance, and financial services unless the oil was sold below the cap. Since 95% of the world's maritime insurance flows through London and Western tankers dominate global shipping, this seemed like checkmate. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called it a new kind of sanction. European officials predicted it would slash Putin's war chest by $160 million per day. The narrative was clean. Russia would be forced to choose between economic collapse or accepting a permanent discount. Either way, the West wins. The myth rested on 3 assumptions. First, that Russia couldn't move oil without Western logistics. Second, that buyers, India, China, Turkey, would comply because they feared secondary sanctions. Third, that you can't fake a ship's identity, its insurance, or its cargo at scale. All 3 assumptions were wrong. Within 6 months of the price cap's implementation, Russia's oil exports didn't fall. They surged. In August 2023, Russia exported 8.1 million barrels per day, the highest level since the invasion of Ukraine began. Revenues, adjusted for global price fluctuations, remained within 10% of pre-war levels. The cap wasn't killing the trade, it was transforming it. The sanctions didn't stop the oil, they made it invisible. Let's dissect how the shadow fleet actually works, because this is where the myth collapses into mechanics. Case study 1, the vanishing tanker. In March 2023, a vessel called the Kazan loaded crude oil at the Russian port of Novorossiysk, its official destination, Fujairah, UAE. Midway through its journey, the ship's AIS signal went dark for 72 hours, a practice known as going ghost. When it reappeared, it was docked in India, offloading its cargo to a refinery in Jamnagar. The oil was sold at $58 per barrel, just under the cap. On paper, compliance. In reality, evasion. How? The ship had ship-to-ship transferred its cargo in the middle of the Mediterranean to another tanker with different ownership, different insurance, and a different flag. The original Kazan then sailed empty to a Turkish port where it was reflagged, renamed, and sent back to Russia. The entire transaction took 11 days and involved 4 different corporate entities across 3 jurisdictions. No Western insurer touched it. No G7 enforcement body tracked it. Here's the bottleneck the West thought was unbreakable: insurance. Every tanker carrying oil must have protection and indemnity, P&I insurance. If a ship spills oil or crashes, the cleanup costs billions. The 13 clubs that provide this insurance, collectively called the International Group, are all based in Europe and the UK. When the sanctions hit, they announced they would not insure Russian oil cargoes sold above 60 bints. Russia's response? It created its own. The Russian National Reinsurance Company, RNRC, backed by state funds, began issuing policies. These policies are not recognized by most ports. They wouldn't hold up in international court, but they exist on paper. And in the fog of global shipping, paper is often enough. Here's the trick. A tanker leaves Russia with Russian insurance, sails to a friendly port like Fujairah or Port Said, transfers the cargo to another ship with opaque insurance from a firm in, say, Dubai or Mumbai, and that second ship delivers the oil to India or China. The buyer can claim they never touched Russian-insured cargo. The seller can claim they followed the rules. Everyone is lying, but no one can prove it.
The cap is $60 per barrel. So how do you sell Russian oil for $75 without triggering sanctions? You don't call it Russian oil, you blend it. In refineries across India and Turkey, Russian crude is mixed with oil from Kazakhstan, Iraq, or the UAE. Once blended, the oil's origin becomes murky. It's then re-exported as refined product to Europe. The EU banned Russian crude imports but still allows refined diesel and gasoline from third countries. India's diesel exports to Europe tripled in 2023. Where did the crude come from? No one asks. Everyone knows. The shadow fleet doesn't break the law. It makes the law irrelevant. The shadow fleet is not chaos. It's a system, a new economic structure that operates on a principle I call the fog premium. In traditional markets, transparency reduces cost. The more you know about a product, its origin, its quality, its legal status, the cheaper it becomes to trade. Trust lowers transaction costs.
This is Econ 101.
The shadow fleet inverts this. Opacity is the product. Risk is the currency. The less you know about a ship's true owner, its insurance, its cargo's origin, the more valuable that ambiguity becomes because it allows all parties to maintain plausible deniability. Here's how the fog premium works in practice. A Chinese refinery wants Russian oil but doesn't want to violate U.S. sanctions. It doesn't buy directly from Rosneft. Instead, it buys from a trading company in Dubai, which bought from a shell company in Singapore, which bought from a tanker operator in Liberia, which bought from Russia. Each middleman adds 2 to 4% to the price. This is the fog premium, the cost of layering transactions to obscure the trail. For Russia, this premium is a tax on evasion. Russian Urals crude that should sell at $75 based on Brent benchmarks ends up netting $68 after middlemen take their cut. But $68 is still $8 above the cap. Russia earns less than it would in a free market, but far more than the G7 intended. For buyers, the fog premium is the price of access. India and China aren't paying $60 for Russian oil. They're paying $65.70, but they're getting it reliably, in volume, and with enough legal murkiness that they can defend their purchases in public. For the middlemen, the ship operators, the traders, the insurers in jurisdictions like Dubai, Fujairah, and Mumbai, the fog premium is pure profit. They are the new oligarchs of the sanctions economy. They don't produce oil. They don't refine it. They produce opacity, and opacity in 2024 is more valuable than crude. This creates a second structure, ghost tonnage. There are now over 600 ships in the shadow fleet. Most are old, 15, 20 years past their prime. Many were bought for scrap and resurrected. Their ownership is deliberately fragmented across dozens of shell companies. Their flags change every few months. They are, in maritime terms, zombies, ships that legally exist but operationally disappear. Ghost tonnage is untouchable by traditional enforcement because it exploits the gaps in international maritime law. A ship registered in Gabon, owned by a company in Belize, insured in Mumbai, and managed from an office in Moscow exists in a legal no man's land. Which jurisdiction enforces the sanctions? Who even has standing to board and inspect it? The shadow fleet doesn't fight the rules. It lives in the spaces between them. But the West isn't standing still. In late 2023 and early 2024, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, launched a series of escalations. They began sanctioning not just Russian entities, but the ships themselves, designating specific vessels as blocked property. If a tanker is sanctioned, any port that accepts it risks losing access to the U.S. financial system. In October 2023, OFAC sanctioned 18 tankers in a single day. Within weeks, several were reflagged. Within months, 2 were scrapped, and the rest were sold to newly created shell companies. The Treasury responded by sanctioning those companies. The shell companies dissolved and reappeared under new names in new jurisdictions. It became a game of whack-a-mole at 500,000 tons per vessel. The enforcement waves created a new dynamic, risk arbitrage. Some ship operators decided the fog premium wasn't worth the sanctions risk. They exited. Others saw opportunity. Tankers that had been worth $25 million suddenly sold for $45 million, not because they were better ships, but because they had the right flags, the right networks, and the right willingness to operate in the gray. This is where the system gets interesting. The shadow fleet isn't monolithic. It's stratified. There are Tier 1 operators, sophisticated networks with deep ties to Russian state oil companies, operating 50, 100 vessels with professional management. These are the backbone. Then there are Tier 2 operators, smaller players, often Greek or Turkish ship owners who bought 5 to 10 aging tankers and are running them on razor-thin margins. They're the volatile layer. When enforcement tightens, they panic. When it eases, they flood back in. And then there's Tier 3, the truly desperate. These are single ship owners, often individuals, operating vessels that are barely seaworthy.
They undercut everyone on price, sail without credible insurance, and sometimes disappear mid-voyage. In June 2024, a Tier 3 tanker called the Laodicea broke apart off the coast of Yemen, spilling 200,000 barrels into the Red Sea. No one claimed ownership. No insurance paid out. The cleanup cost $80 million, funded by a coalition of neighboring states. This is the dark side of the fog premium, when risk becomes externalized onto the environment and third parties. The cat-and-mouse dynamic also revealed an unintended consequence. The shadow fleet made global oil markets less transparent for everyone. Traders in London and New York, who used to track every tanker in real time, now operate with incomplete data. When 15% of global oil shipments go dark for days at a time, price discovery breaks down, volatility spikes, insurance premiums for all tankers rise. The fog premium becomes a tax on the entire system. Sanctions created a new market structure and then lost control of it. So here's where we are. The G7 price cap is still in place. Russia is still selling oil, roughly 80% of it above the cap when you account for middlemen and blended sales. The shadow fleet is still growing. In 2024, it's projected to move over 3 million barrels per day, roughly the equivalent of Iraq's entire export capacity. The West achieved something, but not what it intended. Russian revenues are lower than they would be in a free market. The International Energy Agency estimates Moscow is earning $30–40 billion less per year than if sanctions didn't exist. That's real money, but it's not collapse, it's friction. The price cap didn't stop the trade. It made it slower, riskier, more expensive, but also more profitable for everyone willing to operate in the fog. Meanwhile, the infrastructure of the shadow economy is hardening. The ship operators are professionalizing. The insurance networks are stabilizing. The buyers, India, China, Turkey, are building refining and blending capacity specifically designed to absorb and re-export Russian crude. This isn't a temporary workaround, it's a parallel system, and it's becoming permanent. Here's the deeper question. What happens when sanctions create markets instead of destroying them? The shadow fleet isn't just moving Russian oil, it's proving a model. If you can build an entire logistics network in 18 months to evade the most sophisticated sanctions regime in history, what else becomes possible? Iranian oil is already moving through similar networks. Venezuelan oil, despite U.S. restrictions, is finding buyers through the same middlemen, the same ghost ships, the same fog premium structure. The playbook is exportable. This raises a strategic paradox. The more the West tightens enforcement, the more valuable the shadow fleet becomes. Each sanctioned tanker raises the fog premium, which attracts new capital into the system. Each enforcement wave creates a new Tier 2 operator willing to take the risk. Sanctions, designed to isolate Russia, have instead created a sprawling, lucrative ecosystem of sanctions evasion that now employs thousands, moves billions, and operates beyond the reach of international law. So the question we can't escape is this. When the cost of evasion becomes a new industry, who's really being sanctioned? The seller or the system that depends on transparency?